Welcome to DMs Discuss. Welcome to DMs Discuss, where today DMs will discuss Session 0. I'm Mike.
I'm Chris.
I'm Scott.
And today we're going to be talking about the session that comes before your adventure. We're going to talk about establishing boundaries, party composition and character creation, backstory, adventure hooks, player introduction, character introduction, and other things that you like to do in the Session 0 that leads into the campaign that helps kind of shape where everything's going to go.
So let's kick this off with a little note here in my session notes. But I'm on my phone practically 24/7. Like you can't separate me from it. So maybe let's talk about like table etiquette, like phones at the table, texting at the table. Yes, no. How do you guys feel about it?
I think it's fine within reason. I think you have every right to call it out if it starts getting to be too much.
Yeah, as long as players aren't missing their turn and as long as everybody seems engaged. If like you're constantly having to like tap somebody on the shoulder when it's their turn and then they take 10 minutes to do what they're going to do, then that becomes a problem for sure, and it breaks the immersion, it breaks the kind of flow of the game. That can be a problem, but I think within reason, phones aren't a problem. Plus they're like a super handy tool for like looking shit up all the time.
Yeah, I was about to say in a lot of the games, players just have their character sheets on their phone, so
Yeah,
It's hard to police if they're looking up their spell lists or if they're talking to their girlfriend, right?
for sure. I feel the same, and I think that's part of like that should be something that does come up in session 0. If you're one of those DMs who, you prefer people play on paper or something like that, and you don't quite like the mobile phones or you find them distracting. Like session 0 is a good place to establish some of these boundaries. Like I personally don't mind it because when I play, I mean, most of my stuff is on my phone anyways, D&D Beyond, etc. So
Yeah,
I
I
feel
have
like
3 monitors for a reason, right?
yeah. I feel like that's something that can like that's one of the boundaries when we talk about establishing boundaries in session 0 is like table etiquette, right? Like phones, texting, what else kind of falls under that?
I think for table etiquette, a lot of it is making sure that players know that everybody needs to get a turn. So when there's stuff that's happening outside turn order, you need to kind of like read the table, read the room, and make sure that everybody's engaged. And that's like partially the DM's responsibility, but is also partially on players to make sure that they're not like dominating the outside of combat time, right?
Yeah. And I think that can be hard. Like especially for me, I tend to ramble a bit. And I get a little bit anxious sometimes. So if there's quiet, I tend to try and fill that silence. But I've literally had a DM had an enemy cast silence on me as a joke because he's like, But as a DM, I think that's kind of stuff you can do in establishing boundaries at the table or talking about it beforehand is like, you know, things like paying attention and being ready for your turn, things like that. How do you guys feel about like swearing, drug use at the table?
I personally have no issue with swearing, and I mean, drug use. I feel there's definitely a line I'm going to draw somewhere with that.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the party members. Like if they're like, I think that is again something you establish and you talk about during session 0. If you have people that are dealing with addiction problems that are or that have like a history of addiction that don't want to deal with that in their fantasy world that you're creating for them, then I mean that's a topic you would stray away from.
Yeah, I think there's when you're talking when you're having a session 0 and talking about some of these topics, like there's things that are in-game topics that might be sensitive for people, and there's like out-of-game topics too, or out-of-game kind of behavior, right? Like I personally don't mind, if someone comes to the table and they've had a few drinks, or if they've smoked a joint or something like that. Like for me, as long as they're able to pay attention and contribute, I don't really doesn't really bother me.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
Yeah, for sure. I think as long as everybody's on the same page about those things and you establish that, then yeah, I have no problem personally with people coming to the table and having a couple drinks. I think it gets more interesting as people lose inhibition when you're playing D&D sometimes.
Hmm.
People are more prone, like even people that like don't normally get into the role play, if they've had a couple of drinks at the table, might get a little bit more into it than they normally would, and that can lead to some really fun moments. So
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, like, if anyone listening has listened to our first few episodes, like we met playing D&D at bars. So, having a beer or something like that at the table was pretty commonplace. And, I can't say that anyone was ever high out of their mind or like drunk to the point where it like caused an issue in the game. Generally, people are pretty respectful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody like just needs to know their limit and know when they're still going to be contributing to the game and not just being a detriment. And I think that's again just something that can be established. Like if somebody gets too drunk, you just call the session at that point, right? Like if they're not able to help anymore, and you don't want to like split the party and do weird stuff like that, it could be a good time to end the session if it's long enough into a session that it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean that like as a DM too, if you're uncomfortable with some of this stuff, that's stuff like there might be some DMs listening that are kind of younger and are not comfortable with swearing or, like extreme violence and things like that. And that's at a session zero, that's kind of some of the things you can bring up, right?
Yeah, like it's if you're running a game, if I'm running a game for my nephew, it's gonna be a lot different than if I'm running a game for friends. With my nephew, I might say like, yeah, you did a bunch of damage to it, and it's now unconscious on the ground. You're no longer in combat. Whereas with a friend, I might let them describe in intimate detail how they eviscerate the thing they've been fighting for the last 15 rounds. So
It's only
it,
fair.
it,
If
it
I
all
crit a
depends.
goblin, I get a Mortal Kombat fatality.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, and some people enjoy that. And I mean there's nothing wrong with that. Like I'm not, you know, I don't think kind of I think like fantasy and fiction and reality are two very separate things. And some people do enjoy kind of that gory or you know they like describing that like decapitating some goblin or it's fun for them. And I think that's like especially if you're playing with a group of strangers, that's stuff that should come up in session 0 is just kind of getting a feel for everybody's like sensitivity level in regards to some of these topics, right?
Yeah, I think this really goes into like the kind of stuff that you should go through is like, be it a homebrew campaign or one that a pre-made module that you're using. Really going through it, trying to like picking out some common things that would be sensitive topics and kind of having those ready. Could also be able to fear of heights, spiders, certain types of like mental situations they could be in, and like kind of like running through like this is what you're gonna see, or is everyone cool with this?
Yeah, and there's obviously some of the bigger ones like racism, sexism, etc. And that stuff like there are parts of D&D lore that do kind of touch on that and might resonate with certain people. Like in D&D, some of the drowves are seen as either lesser or people like fear the drowves and things like that, and they're kind of seen as evil, right? And for some people, that can be kind of a sensitive like topic, right?
Yeah, for sure. And again, those are just things that you always want to try to explore during session zero. There are obviously things where that you might miss when you're talking about that though, and that's why there have been these like really cool initiatives set up within the D&D community, stuff like the X card, where if you miss it in a session zero, you can still have this like go to where if something comes up in game, players know they can raise their hand and immediately you know that something's gone too far, something's hit a nerve, something's touched a topic that you don't want to explore into, and you can kind of backtrack and start over from there,
Yeah,
explore what it was, talk to them, and figure out where you need to go from there. So
yeah. And I think for people who don't know what the X card is, it's basically like a veto on what's happening. So let's say you're uncomfortable with your bard is being a typical bard and hitting on the bartender, and things get to a point where you're as a person uncomfortable. There's sometimes I think Toronto D&D, do they actually have a card you slide into the
mhm,
table?
Yeah,
Okay, and then in some
they do, yeah.
campaigns we've had players just say X card, X card, and that just that denotes you're uncomfortable with the topic. Drop it, move on, and as a player at that table, if someone does X card, no questions asked, drop it, move on. So as a DM,
Yeah,
I think I like that.
yeah. Both players and DM need to know that if an X card gets played, there's no discussion about it unless it's player and DM privately about what set them off and where to backtrack to. Um, there is no like vetoing an X card play. If an X card gets used, you backtrack to where the players are all comfortable and you move forward from there.
Yeah, and I think that's and it doesn't necessarily have to be a backtrack, but let's say someone is hitting on the bartender and someone else X card, that bard should, okay, well, thanks for the drinks and kind of drop it
yeah,
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the last thing you want at a D&D table is one of your players running off crying or one of your players being, you know,
yeah. Just not feeling
upset or
comfortable and enjoying the session to the fullest
Yeah,
because
exactly. I play D&D and I run D&D to escape from the shittiness of the actual world, right? I don't need to experience that again in game.
yeah. And there are there are cases where people do kind of explore some of that in game, and that's kind of like a therapy for them. I know for me, there's topics in game that made me a little bit uncomfortable, but exploring them was kind of like fun for me, or um like in a way kind of therapeutic, or let me kind of address things like personally. um but yeah, I mean, if someone's at the table and they're uncomfortable and they X card, or vocalize that they're uncomfortable, um at session zero you should kind of talk about this stuff and how people at the table should react to that. So
Yeah. Another useful thing that I found, I'm probably going to be implementing in like future games if I need to use it professionally, is there's someone who made a digital RPG consent checklist. Essentially, just has a list of like pretty much any topic that could be sensitive, and you can label it as either green, yellow, or red. With green being I'm fine with it, yellow being like not so sure about it, and red being like absolutely not. And
so
it's useful because it just covers like pretty much all the bases. So if you're
Yeah.
not like sure about stuff you might run into, it might be good just to send this out to players. It could be form fillable. They send it back to you, and you're like, "Cool, not going to talk about this stuff."
yeah, and I
That's a
think
really good
this
idea. I like that a lot.
yeah, I like that idea too. And I mean, it kind of falls into that whole consent space, right? Like, people who are signing up for this game are signing up for fun, signing up for like an adventure. They're not really signing up for things like sexism, racism.
Yeah.
Um,
The nice thing about the forum too is it doesn't. You don't have to like discuss these things in front of the whole table. It's just good to get this done ahead of time. Because there's some stuff you might not think about, like it could be even be just be like physical abuse could be something they don't want to talk about that and say,
yeah,
"Hey, don't do that."
for sure.
Yep. No, absolutely. I think that's a
Yeah,
great idea.
I think with friends this is a little easier. Like
Yes.
having a chat about like and sometimes even in our sessions, like we've had session zeros, but we haven't had like extreme talks about boundaries or anything like that. Like there's just kind of a consensus and people know. And X cards have been used at our tables and everyone's been pretty respectful of
Yeah.
it. So
I think thing is too, it's like, for the most part, a lot of especially pre-written modules and stuff make stays away from any like sensitive areas for the
yeah,
most part. There's like, it's action adventure PG-13 for the most part. There's undeads, there's some scary things, but nothing gets real.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
I think if you're using like official published material, there's probably less of that. But if you're going into homebrew and this is a medieval setting, so sometimes like things like racism, sexism, they do come up in the setting. So just be prepared for that and know, your players' sensitivity and your players' kind of thoughts on these topics, and try to steer away from them if anyone is uncomfortable with them.
Yeah. I think that moves on to like the other part of you've got your content all laid out for them is establish player and player interaction. Like, do you allow people to steal from their party? Do you let them like betray them? Like, what level of that stuff are you okay with? Because I think that it's possible to play an evil character interestingly, but it could also really slow the game down if someone's just like, "Oh, haha, I killed them all in their sleep."
For sure. And I think that kind of leads us into like we've talked about establishing boundaries in terms of table etiquette, in terms of, swearing at the table, sensitive topics, etc. And this is kind of player behavior. But now when we talk about like character behavior, or like character behavior within your setting, like you said, what's allowed? Is PvP allowed? Is stealing or
Yeah.
attacking another player allowed? And I think that comes down to like, we could talk about party composition, character creation, and kind of alignment. So part of session zero is establishing boundaries, but also kind of having this chat about party composition, character creation.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's a lot of DMs who won't allow an evil character at the table, and I think that um, if a player wants to play an evil character, and they can justify why they would be playing an evil character and how that would fit into the campaign and fit into the party, and how they all kind of share goals and whatnot, I think that it can actually be really interesting to have an evil player in your campaign. So that's one thing that like you can establish is the alignments that you want your players to have or that you allow your players' characters to bring.
Hmm.
Do you guys always have players bring options when they come to a session zero, or do they usually come with one character idea that they've like kind of fleshed out?
Usually it's been just like one character idea. I'm sure if I had like a big note, chances are some of them would have options. But no, I've never been like presented with like multiple choices really.
I think for me as a player, I've generally brought a few options just because like I have my main character, and then I'm like, well, if three other people are playing cleric,
Clerics.
uh, I might have a backup there. But I think when it comes to that, like party composition for me, I don't really see D&D as an MMO. You don't need one tank, one healer, two DPS. Like that's not how I see D&D. You can come with five DPS as a DM. If they have five DPS, give them a healing sidekick or make potions readily available. But in terms of party composition, like generally the stuff I run for you guys was one shots, so I didn't really care. So just bring one character.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd say that focusing too much on like party composition, you can let the players do that. But as a DM, I don't really mind because I'll figure it out and work around if we're gonna change some stuff. Because combat favors like one way or the other.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's totally fair.
as a DM, I don't think you should enforce any sort of like you guys need a healer or you need this or you need that. Let the players play what they want. I think it's more so like telling the players like, "Hey, come to session 0 with a character in mind and maybe a backup just in case someone else has similar character and you don't like that, right?" Like I know for me if I'm playing a rogue and someone else is playing a rogue, even though they're different subclasses, they tend to feel the same, so I probably wouldn't want to play a rogue in that campaign.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And that's more what I was thinking is not like trying to enforce a party composition, but more not wanting to have players feel like they're being overshadowed by somebody that is like a similar archetype or the same class but a little bit different. I just want people to know that like their character's unique and be able to play a unique character. So I usually try to have people bring a couple of options just in case you end up with a party of five clerics somehow.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think like if I was running a longer campaign and I was with new players or I know if I'm with players that I know and are experienced, there's probably a Discord chat, and you guys are figuring out what your party composition is, and
Mhm.
you guys are probably not going to come with four sorcerers because you're actually talking. But in a party, if you're putting together a campaign full of new players, them instructing them to like pick your main class, but maybe have a class on the side that if your main class doesn't work out in session 0, you can kind of fall back on or you'd be
Yeah,
interested in.
or you can just do what Chris does and tell us to bring multiple characters and have them ready because they are more likely going to die a couple sessions into what's going on.
Then have that threat backfire and have everyone go super healy tanks.
Yeah. So I feel like for session 0, your players should come to session 0 with at least an idea of kind of what class they're going to play. And at this point, as a DM, if they haven't rolled up a character sheet on D&D Beyond, this is a good time to kind of help them flesh out their character. If you're doing rolled stats like we talked about in the previous episodes, having people roll in front of you now is not a bad idea. Getting their stats set up and some people might come with a backstory too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And backstories I think are important because also when you come with a character idea, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a class. Like you could bring a character idea or a character concept to session 0, find out you already have two bards and end up playing it as like a warlock sorcerer or playing it as something that is a different set of classes than you originally intended, but is still like the same character in essence, and is you're still able to play them the way you want to. So I think that's another thing that is super interesting about D&D is that you can really create the same personality in a character without having to tie it to a class or subclass per se.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And I think when you're directing your players to come to session 0, you know, having that class in mind or that backstory in mind, and why are they adventuring? Where do they come from? Like, what are their characters' goals? And I know as a first time player, like you look at my backstory for Aegis, and it's a good like 3 paragraphs. You look at my backstory for Kierna, and it's literally like 3 bullet points. So, um,
Yeah, exactly. I feel like I'm the same way. I have probably 15 unplayed characters that I've created over time that I've like come up with concepts and thought through very kind of minimal backstories for, and they've all got just like point form, 5 or 6 points of why they're a character, what they're doing, what their goals are. But I think if your characters come to a session 0 with even that, just a point form, these are my goals, you're gonna see some overlap there. And as a DM, that's a really useful tool for you to take that overlap and help build the relationship between those characters. And the players themselves can take those like overlapping ideas that they've had and form those into a relationship between characters that really helps drive the campaign forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think like in a one shot, maybe backstory is not as important. A lot of that stuff is not going to be integrated into your 1 or 2 sessions. But in a long running campaign, having your players have a bit of a backstory kind of gives you a bit more, more wood for your DM fire.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And also, there's the idea of something that our friend Matt is doing his next campaign is having a backstory buddy, where essentially, before this, you've given players like a loose adventure hook, and you essentially pair them off and say, come up with a backstory together that you guys have met before this campaign starts, just to
Yeah,
add a little bit of extra like flair and history to everything.
yeah, and some people kind of do this. I know in the campaign that we played in, like Pungeons and Flagons, with Mike, my first character had no connection to kind of anyone. I was just a cleric at the table. But when Aegis Aegis took a little hiatus from the party in game, I brought Lilith in, and I talked to Mike like, hey. Can Lilith and Greg have known each other? Like maybe they worked together in the Underdark and they're old friends, and that kind of gave Lilith an into the party. Like, hey, Greg, how you been? Right. So having even with strangers, like having them have some sort of connection between their characters can be a cool kind of. It's not just four random people who decided to form a party for no reason, right?
I think that helps a lot with session zeros, and that also helps with like a far different topic we'll probably explore at some point. But like adding characters mid campaign or adding new players mid campaign,
Yeah,
having that kind of backstory buddy or having that tie into the party is huge. Like just wandering through the forest and finding a new person gets old after like the first 5 or 6 times.
yeah, for sure.
So, like, being able to have that established backstory and being able to have those characters play off of each other because they have that history is a really cool uh, tool.
Yeah, for sure. So I know as a new DM, you might be looking at character sheets and you're seeing bonds and flaws and kind of all these things. And they're not necessary, but as a new player, sometimes in the guides too, there are tables you can roll on, like roll a d10 and you pick a flaw based on your roll, and that can be fun for new players, or just having them think about one and pick one. Like your flaw could be that you don't like your hair being messy, and that could play into your character. I don't necessarily think they're required, but they can be fun for a new player to kind of come up with and help with the RP and things like
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. It helps new players RP, I think, but it also like you said before, as a DM, it really helps. Like in our Wednesday game, having one of the players come to me at the beginning with this idea that they were a divination wizard that had belonged to this order and they had traveled back, or they were like uh exploring the origins of that order in a new place, gave me a lot of stuff to play with in terms of like dropping hints and
Yeah.
adding that imagery to a world where it didn't exist before to really kind of help tie party members and cool moments together. So you can really glean a lot of stuff to add, even if you're not doing a homebrew world, even if it is something that is a pre-written campaign, you can add a lot of uh, like nuance to things by exploring your characters' backstories and taking little bits from it and making them kind of main story points of something they wouldn't otherwise be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll probably get a little bit more into that in next sessions where we talk about things like, preparing quests and kind of, player quests and quests that tie directly into your players' backstories. But when we talk about session zero, like what would be the minimum you would require players to bring?
I would say a solid idea of a character with like a backup. So if not a fully made character, just be like, yeah, I'm gonna play like a human fighter, probably called Dave. And at the very least that, and kind of have a loose idea of what they want to go to, backstory, stuff like that. Doesn't have to be fully fleshed out, but at least a core character concept.
Yeah, I think by the end of session zero, you come up with what your character is actually going to be. But coming into a session zero, exactly that, like just I'm a I'm a human, I'm a fighter, and yeah, my name's Dave, and I'm here because I want gold, and I would come from a poor background.
I think part of session zero as a DM too, and you can do this before session zero, but you can also represent it at session zero. Is kind of your adventure hook, giving your players an idea of like where these characters will be. Like, you're being dropped into a remote island that's been uninvestigated, and you're going through to, you've been paid to determine what it is, or there's been a murder of the king and you are being hired to investigate. So having that kind of hook as like, giving them an idea of where they're being dropped in, because, you know, that might affect their character decisions and things like the finalization of their character anyways.
Oh yeah, I think adventure hook being established during character creation is pretty key because you don't want to have a situation where you try to get things started and you're like, anyways, you're walking through a forest and it's like my character hates trees, he'd never go outside.
Yeah.
A lot of people like to leave it until session one, where they're just like, okay, we've established who your characters are and why they're together, but now here's your adventure. And I think having an idea of what the adventure is going to be, so you can tie the players to that in some way, is huge. Like especially if you can tie it to a character backstory is super important. What you really need to do is look at your either your players or your characters and find something that you know is going to like absolutely hook one of them at least, so that you can have them fight for the party to be hooked into it.
Yeah. And I
Like
mean,
look at what the motivations of players, the motivations of characters are, and then design your hook around that.
yeah, and some of those motivations might be just motivations that drive people in real life, right? Like fame, money, family bonds, curiosity, knowledge. Those
Saving
can
the
all
world.
saving the world.
99% of D&D hooks are going to be fame, money, or saving the world.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's what they should be. Like that's what D&D is about, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But knowing which one of those three to use is a huge thing, and it really depends on the characters and what they bring.
And the thing is that I don't think as an adventure hook you have to pick one, because different kind of things might appeal to different people, right? So
Mhm.
your hook could, I know that in Lost Mines of Fandelver, part of the hook is that one of the characters is related to somebody who went missing, and
Mhm.
that's their kind of hook. Whereas other characters are like, oh, there's a lot of money involved in transporting goods, right? So
Yeah, for sure. And like with Strahd, we look at it because you are an established party adventure because you were starting at level 3. So you've already been the saviors of the city for a while, and there's a new threat to the city. Who's going to deal with that threat? It's going to be you, right? Like you're the saviors
yeah,
of the city. It's your job to do this now. You've established yourselves as the people that do this. So now there's a problem. You got to go fix it, right?
yeah, and having that discussion about your adventure hook can affect a lot of your players' decisions as to not only classes but things like backgrounds and stuff like that. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, having an adventure hook that allows your players to like kind of fully explore what they've given you as a part of their backstory and what they're like what they've given you as part of their personality
mhm.
is definitely an exciting thing to do.
Yeah, so I think like during session zero, obviously everyone's kind of meeting each other, and you have these the player introductions. There might be people at your session zero who have never met before.
I think outside of just backstory, having players themselves talk to each other and talk to the DM is important because you can ask players, if it's not a group of established friends and it is new people, like what part of the game they enjoy the most, right? Because as a DM, when you're designing these adventures, you're gonna either be like RP heavy, you're gonna be combat heavy, you might be like a solid mix of both. So knowing what your players want and what your players expect, and also what your players think their strengths in D&D are. Like if your players are expecting a lot of RP and want a lot of RP, you're gonna design like a lower magic, um, lower combat campaign. Whereas if your players are just there to kill goblins, then you're going to be more focused on the combat, less focused on the RP, right? So it all depends on what your players think their strengths are and what they want to get out of the game. And I think that's an important question to ask during session 0 as well.
Yeah, I think back to what Scott says as well. Like the big part of session zero is it gives everyone a chance to first like feel things out, get to know each other a little bit. Kind of set the tone for party dynamics. and have a chance to talk about this stuff before the game actually starts instead of being like, hey, some of you are strangers, let's start playing a role-playing game. Having a chance to really talk both in and out of character and build this stuff together with the party could really set up a good dynamic going forwards.
Yeah. So near the end of session zero, session zero can last 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. But near the end of session zero, I think you're looking to have everyone meet each other. You're looking to have boundaries established. You're looking to kind of present your adventure hook, and then near towards the end of it, you're looking to have people with pretty much finalized characters, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think that goes towards like setting expectations. Like personally, I try to do like a little bit of like the start of the adventure hook during the session zero, to try and like have everyone like get running with it and get like hype for the adventure. Not like a full start, maybe even just like a half an hour of like loose role play, like introducing their PCs and stuff.
Yeah.
Just get a feeling for it. Even just like they could even just like role play a small section of their backstory about like what set them off in the journey before the journey.
Absolutely. I love to end session zeros on a cliffhanger. Like I love to like establish boundaries, get the party composition, get characters like fully finalized, get all your backstory stuff done, give your adventure hook after you get like a brief kind of character intro. And then as soon as your characters accept your adventure hook, when something is about to happen, that's like, all right, we're gonna call for tonight, and I'll see you guys all at the table like next Tuesday, and that's where this will begin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's okay. I'm kind of I think it can go either way. I think if, as a DM, if you do want your session zero to kind of, when everyone finishes introducing and they kind of have their characters finalized, which may or may not happen because some people might be indecisive and still figuring things out. But if everyone does have their characters and you do have something prepared for session zero, yeah, giving that blurb might be a nice hook and get people kind of rearing to go. I don't think it's like 100% necessary though. I think you
Oh,
can end
it's not
session.
necessary.
Yeah.
I just that's one thing. It's up to you as a DM if you feel that's a good start for it. I tend to like specifically tell my players it's going to be a long session zero because we're going to like get that stuff out of the way and then play just a little bit.
Yeah, and your other option is to like, you know, just have your session zero. Let's say you're gonna play every day Tuesday at 7:30. You do have the option of scheduling your session zero 6:30 so that you can kind of get stuff and have a little bit of time. You also have the option of like, hey, is everyone available Monday for session zero, and then we're gonna start on Tuesday. And you also have the option of okay, we're gonna do session zero. Everyone kind of talks and gets to know each other, finalize their character, and then at the very end of that, we're just gonna call it a night, and we'll start next week. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's all up to the preference of players and of the DM. I just love to do the cliffhanger because I think it builds suspense and really gets players wanting to be at the table for the first session.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of character introductions, like, do you have your players introduce their characters to each other during this? Do they talk about their backstory? I mean, I know for me, generally with my characters as a player, I when I kind of make my backstory and things like that, and some of your players might do this. Like my characters now have a few bullet points as a backstory, and I kind of like to let my character develop as like part of the game. Um, but do you have your characters kind of go through that stuff in session zero with each other, or you know?
I think it really depends. Usually, like at the very least, I want everyone at the table to know like who everyone is, what character they're playing, and loosely what they are. Uh, I feel like going into like backstory and stuff may not be, especially if the character doesn't want to reveal their backstory right away. I usually try to leave that up to the players because maybe you're gonna have like some like big twist in your arc that you're gonna like work through, and you're not gonna be like, oh yeah, hey, like my name is Jeff and I'm a monk, and my mother ran away at a young age, and I'm trying to find her ever since. That's gonna be my big arc. I'm gonna find her. It's just be like, I'm Jeff. I'm a monk, and I like cheese.
Yeah, it all depends on what you want to do, like as a player. Like I like to let my players decide. Like I'll talk to them ahead of time, and I might know more than the other players will know about what their characters are, what their goals are, what their backstory looks like. I might know more about that than other players, but I definitely have at least like a brief introduction so that people know like who they are, what their name is, probably what like race they present as at least, and then like what they are saying their current goals are, but that is basically it. Like I let players have kind of free reign as to what they want to disclose to the rest of the party, and everything else just comes out as exposition during the campaign.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think for me, like a lot of my characters generally have some kind of things in their backstory that I like. I'm not gonna come to session zero or session one and like Chris said, you know, my name is
Reveal the whole
I'm
arc.
here. Yeah, you're not gonna reveal everything.
Yeah,
So, if your character wants to say like if one of your players says like, my name is Kovacs, just Kovacs. And that's it. And that's all they want to say. Let them do that. It's fun, right?
Yeah.
totally. And yeah, you learn more about these characters as the campaign goes on, right?
Yeah.
I think another good part too is the classic, like who do they see as you kind of like this, depending on what you're doing for session zero, might not happen. This might happen in the first session. But if it comes down to, like you usually ask them like, what does your character look like? They see this guy walking up to them. What do they see?
Yeah. And some players might be really intricate here. You know, like I am 5'7.5". I have blonde flowing hair. I have
Blood
blue
type
eyes,
AB
sparkling.
positive.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It really I think that comes down to how seasoned the players are, because like you said, your first character had a 5 paragraph intro and your new character has a 4 bullet
Bullet
point
points.
intro.
Kier-
So
yeah. Aegis' backstory goes on, and Kieran's backstory is like female, lycanthrope, killed captors, ran away. Like that is Kieran's backstory.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm the exact same way. Like Greg has I could write a fucking novel about his backstory and about the struggle that his life was leading up to getting into the Black Shrek.
Yeah.
And with Carmi, that is my backup character for Chris's campaign, I can literally do a voice that I like, so that's a
Yeah.
character now.
And I mean
I
Right?
that's
mean,
Like
totally fine. Yeah.
sometimes you just have those like novels like in the back of your mind, but only the key points come up. Like,
exactly.
I play a bard of the College of Lore as a whole story about how many magical secrets he's learned.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally a part of the College of Lore.
But yeah, I think in terms of a session zero, like this is kind of your opportunity as a DM to veto or nix stuff, or watch your players roll their stats in front of you, look at their class and race selection. Like if you as a DM are only allowing classes or races from the player's handbook, that's the time to say, oh, you picked this class and this class isn't available or this race isn't available, and this is your chance as a DM to kind of give that final once over and see if you're cool with everything that's going on.
Yeah, actually, that is something we didn't really discuss much, but also is, if you want to pare stuff down for character creation, for like setting specific races, content, things like that. If you're like, no, like there's this whole thing where like there's no minotaurs in this whole land,
Hmm.
so you can't be one of those. That's another good thing to establish as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or if you just don't like the races from Magic the Gathering being part of D&D, you can say that that's not a thing that exists in the world that you're currently in, right?
yeah, and we touched on that in the previous episode where we talked about like what races will be allowed and what source materials will be allowed. I think for me, even though it's daunting as a DM, maybe if you're a first time DM and you're full of new players, maybe saying players handbook only, that can be a really easy thing for everybody. And it also limits the number of source books that you need to reference. But there's a lot of good stuff in a lot of the official material. I think as a new DM, either going like PHP only, players handbook only, or saying any official material, so anything that's been published. Once you start getting into UA, which is Unearthed Arcana, which is kind of like Wizards like playtest stuff and beta stuff, things start to get a little funnier along those lines. So
Yeah, it definitely gets a little wonky when you get into UA. I would say if you are a first time DM, you want to stick to like published things only, and maybe even like anything before Tasha's, because even PHP and Xanathar's is really easily manageable.
yeah, and you also have the what you may find is players might come to session zero with the homebrew class that they really like, and you don't know if that's really balanced. Like it could be somebody wrote that class and they this level 1 ranger does 10d10 attacks, and that's obviously not balanced. That's going to make other players feel lessened and weaker as a character. So I think sticking to official material and kind of calling that out if someone does bring something UA and just being like, hey, this is UA and we're sticking to PHP or
Yeah,
other things.
and ultimately that's up to you as a DM. Like maybe you think it's cool. If they ask you to look it over, I mean, it's up to you if you want to just write stuff off. I am always extremely wary of any homebrew class because there's 90% chance there's something ridiculous with them.
Something's for sure broken if somebody's homebrewed their own class, because if it wasn't broken, it would probably already exist in some form.
I don't know. I mean, I'm working on that subclass, and I don't necessarily know that it's like super OP. So I wouldn't say discount all homebrew. But hey, if you're a DM and you want to allow homebrew, and you have the and your player understands that, hey, during the course of the campaign, I might adjust some of your stuff because it's just ridiculous. Then
Yeah.
I think that's okay. If you want to take that up as a DM, I think that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, that's up to you if you want to take it with a critical eye, read it over, think it through, and always, I would say, especially give yourself the back door to modify things if you just didn't realize that something could be applied incredibly maliciously.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about establishing boundaries, party composition, character creation, having your players create backstories, and maybe even having a backstory buddy. We talked about everyone introducing themselves and kind of getting to know each other, adventure hook, and kind of you know character finalization slash optional character introductions.
Mhm.
What else is like? Does that cover session zero, or what else do you guys
I'd say
think?
there'd be one other thing is going over if you're making any adjustments to the base rules of the game. There's a lot of rules that are optional that show up in source material, especially in Dungeon Master's Guide, Xanathar's, additional combat rules, things like that. And it's important that your players know like which ones we're using. There's additional actions you can take. Are you going to use flanking? Stuff like that. If you're using those, adding in anything of your own, I think it's really important that players are well aware of this before the game starts. So they could prepare for it and just maybe familiarize themselves with the rule set you're going to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Reiterating what house rules exist. I personally love working with brutal criticals. I think it adds a lot of uh, dynamic stuff to the game. As long as it's applied to both characters and enemies, I think needs to happen both ways. But brutal criticals are a thing that make critical strikes feel a lot more meaningful. So that's one house rule like I love playing with, and I think making sure that your players know which ones are ineffective, which ones aren't, is a huge thing for session zero, so that those questions don't come up time and time again during your actual sessions and gameplay.
So why don't you go into what brutal criticals are?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so as a new DM, some of that might be daunting, like house rules. What are house rules? What are these kind of and house rules are things that might vary table to table. It's just like one DM uses this rule and another might not. And that's totally up to you. But as a new DM, if you're overwhelmed by the thought of that, just don't worry about it, right? If you're not sure which house rules or what kind of rules you'll be using, don't worry about it. Just let your players know, hey, I'm looking through source books still, and at some point I might decide to try out a house rule. And usually players don't care at that point. And you can try a house rule and see how it works. I know for me, I like doing like we talk about brutal criticals, which is rolling extra dice on a
Mhm.
crit, or taking
Taking the
like
max damage for one of the die, or
yes.
or take max damage for half of the die.
So
Yeah.
your crits get a little more oomph, and I like that same rule kind of applied to potions personally. 'Cause I think
Mhm.
like rolling a d4 on a potion, getting like healing for 2 or 3 with a potion is just ridiculous. So I mean, as a new DM, if you're not sure which house rules you want to use, just let your players know. Like at some point, I might introduce some additional things we try out, and if you try something out and your players don't like it, then you can say, okay, we're gonna drop that. So I don't think you have to have everything solid, but if you do know what house rules you're going to use, definitely bring those up and let people know about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like some stuff that's really cool that you can bring into session zero to talk about that you can either have your players confirm or veto. I think we're using in one of the campaigns that I was playing in a new inspiration rule where essentially players every week start with inspiration. So the DM essentially lets players either have inspiration once a week or lets players give inspiration to other players once a week so that players can kind of reward their friends for doing cool shit, because as a DM you have so much to manage that it's hard to remember when to give people that inspiration.
Yeah, and that's all stuff you can come to session zero with as a DM. Like, these are particular rules that we'll be using. Um, and I think that's more for experienced DMs. I think if you're a new DM, you don't have to delve too much into some of these house rules. But some common ones. I think a very common rule would be kind of the flanking rule, and we can maybe talk about that in some rule stuff. But if you look up flanking and advantage on attacks, um, flanking is a very common. If a character is surrounded by two other characters, giving them advantage on attacks, that's a pretty common rule
Yeah,
of
for sure. And it encourages your players to work together in a way that they might not if they didn't have that kind of synergy between characters, right?
yeah. I think that and maybe brutal criticals is like two very common house rules. So if you are a new DM and you do like the thought of some of those, like you can definitely look into those, and those are two
Two
common
common rules
rules.
that don't make a lot of work for you as a DM, which is nice.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about boundaries, composition, backstory, all these introductions and house rules, etc. And we touched a little bit on alignment, but I just kind of want to go back there just for a tiny bit.
Mhm.
I know personally as a DM, I like tension between characters. I think it can make for a fun setting. There's a lot of tension between Chris's character and I in your campaign, and that was a really
Yeah.
fun kind of thing for both of us. I'm actually getting a tattoo with part of Chris's character on me because of how fun and impactful that was for me. So I think like having that tension between characters is fun, and I think you can have that tension by having good aligned characters and then more neutral characters. I think once you start to have kind of these evil characters, like Chris, I think only allows like lawful evil.
Yeah, I think like playing an evil character is something that's really best left to experienced players, so it doesn't just
Yeah.
become one character in the party who's just actively sabotaging everything that's trying to happen.
Yeah.
Because like
Yeah.
it does take some nuance to play a character who has their own goals and agenda, but loosely they can still do the campaign without disrupting everything constantly because they're so evil.
Yeah, I personally as a DM like wouldn't allow unless I'm running an evil campaign. Like I would not allow any evil alignment. I just think it just you're putting people together and their goals are so different that there's gonna be like not only problems in character but out of character players will be like, why the hell did you do that? So I feel that can be like a little too much tension.
Yeah, see, I actually like having the same idea as Chris, only lawful evil. Anything outside of that, and it becomes too easy for them to just murder their party members for no reason.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But with lawful evil characters, you can have the same goals and just accept different ends to it, right? Like you can have a character that's lawful evil, that abides by the laws of the land, but will stretch them and bend them to a point where characters that are like chaotic good or chaotic neutral might not take things. So I think that you can have a lot of really cool moments and tension added to a campaign by characters that like know how to play lawful evil. But like Chris said, I think that's best left to players who are experienced enough with the game to know how to apply that alignment properly.
Also, I was gonna say, speaking of alignments, I don't know if you guys remember this, but in my initial pitch for the campaign we all met in, I did specifically mention I only allow lawful evil,
Mhm.
and also I had a little addendum that if you were going to play chaotic neutral, that you had to sign something saying that you understand that chaotic neutral does not mean sarcastic evil.
I do remember that actually because I was thinking about playing a chaotic neutral character when I came into it, and I was like, nah.
yeah,
There's a lot of people. It's like, oh, but he's chaotic. He can do anything. I'm like, he's not evil though.
Yeah, he's still bound by some morals.
yeah. Okay, I mean, I think that like that covers session zero, right? We've talked about kind of all those things that might come up at a session zero. Um,
Yeah, I
and
think we've definitely talked about how to establish the boundaries for your players and for your game. The composition of your party and your character creation. We went through character creation rules in the previous session. This session was more around making sure that you had all of your characters fully created by the end of your session zero. Your backstory and your backstory buddy or your like bonds between characters is important. We went through your adventure hooks and how to introduce them, player and character introductions. So I think the last thing left is really to dig into your first session, right?
yeah, I think so. At this point, I think at the end of session zero, you can do session 0.5, I guess, which is like that little intro. So getting everyone at the table and your characters ride into town and you're coming over a hillside and the sun's setting and you get into town and as you approach the guards, one of them looks at you and goes, "Oh, you're finally here. Go see the Jarl and end it there, right? Like
Yeah.
something like that, just to kind of get your characters into it.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think in the next session, we'll talk about what to know as a DM going into the first session of your campaign, which is super important. So we'll go through prepping for the first session, what you need to prep versus what you need to like be prepared to improv, how you start your campaign, which will be a little bit more on the adventure hook side of things, running the game, and then how you know when is the right time to end a session. And as always, I'm Mike. And if you need to slide into a DM's DMs, you can DM us on Insta, Twitter, Facebook at DMs Discuss, or hit us up via email at dmsdiscuss@gmail.com.
And I'm Chris, and cast Arcane Eye on the subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher app to be notified of new episodes.
And I'm Scott. Hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, check the show notes for links and other fun stuff. We'll catch you after a long rest.